Good morning, everybody, and as Tim said, thank you all very much indeed for coming. What I'd like to do is start off by taking us back in time to 2014, and in 2014 there was a recovery in the UK economy, and all the economic pundits were quite happy to confess that the recovery took them by surprise. It took them by surprise because it came from an unexpected source. It came from increased domestic consumption, increased household consumption. This was at a time when there was not an increase in household income. And it was also at a time when the household balance sheets remained battered and bruised and overborrowed, and therefore it was not the place from which a recovery was expected, and it was a recovery which therefore had a degree of frailty in consequence. And then in 2015, there were 2 quarters in which business investment began to take over, and the Office for Budget Responsibility saw a situation whereby the households were hard-pressed and were unable to continue providing that demand in the economy, and obviously for an economy to move forward, there needs to be the creation of demand within it, and it saw the idea of business investment as taking over that role. Now, whereas households have got balance sheets which are over-borrowed, that is most definitely not the case with the business sector, because the business sector has been running a surplus with the rest of the economy since 2003. So there we had a situation whereby business investment could take over. That would help with the issues of productivity. And in November 2015, the OBR saw a rosy glow around the economy as the prime mover became business investment with the deep pockets that arose from that cash accumulation from 2003 to date. So that was a situation, and now we go back to where we were 12 months ago. Now, between November 2015 and January, February 2016, there was a massive change in sentiment at the OBR. They suddenly found out that that business investment had only been for 2 quarters, and then it had stopped. And so instead of propelling the economy forward, it then seemed to be left again to household consumption and growth in household consumption to carry on that role. And the OBR made a very significant change. It's one of the most significant changes they ever made in that 3-month period in terms of downgrading their forecasts. And that downgrading was focused on 2 things. I say the decline in business investment, so it was a false dawn that they'd seen, and also concerns for the productivity data was also coming through and giving very, very disappointing results. And the GDP forecast for 2016 was therefore downgraded from 2.4% to 2%. Now that seems like a fairly modest fall, but more than that fall was occasioned by the decline in business investment. That was the real driver, and that really changed the mood and sentiment at the Office of Budget Responsibility. And it wasn't just the OBR who were feeling that way, because the OBR, they take their lead in respect of interest rates from the markets. And it's one of these ironic points that the markets had priced in the idea of an interest rate fall in the summer long before the Brexit vote had happened. That expectation had been priced into the markets in January, February and March 2016. Now, the reason why I've given us that backdrop is because I'm sure that in our collective memories and in the folklore of this country, what's going to happen is it's not surprising that every benefit and every bounty and every burden that the UK economy experiences in the next few years is going to be laid at the door of the Brexit referendum. Whereas the reality is that we still have the Great Recession of 2009, 2010 is still working its way through the system. And the forecasts that Philip Hammond introduced, went through in his budget speech, they are far more affected by the impact of that Great Recession than they are by Brexit. And it's clear that that must be the case, because Brexit hasn't yet happened and no one really knows what is going to happen when it does take place. So what we actually have is a situation whereby the Great Recession is continuing to cast a long shadow. And we can see that long shadow very clearly in respect of the government finances. Now, in 2010, we had a new government, and George Osborne looked at the budget deficit and said, I'll have this sorted by 2015-16. So that tick there was to say that was the expectation. There would be a nil budget deficit. In other words, the tax revenues would equate to the government expenditure by 2015-16. That was blown off course almost immediately, and it was blown off course largely because the economy did not rebound in the way that everybody expected it to rebound following the Great Recession. We now have a new Chancellor and a new set of forecasts, and Philip Hammond is now not expecting to balance the budget even by 2021-22. So here we are after more than 10 years of budget cutting and austerity, where there is still anticipated to be a deficit of about £18 billion. It's material in terms of, when one talks about billions and trillions, it really has no meaning unless one can relate it. It's 0.7% of GDP, and so that's still a very significant deficit in terms of the size of the overall economy. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they deliver their green budget in February of this year, and they say that the Chancellor, whoever is in government, and this is made regardless of political colour, whoever is in government will actually struggle to get that budget into balance even by 2024-25. That's the long shadow of the Great Recession. It may be laid at the door of Brexit, but effectively it's the long shadow of the recession that's causing that. And the odd thing about looking at the public deficit and saying, why is it proving so difficult to sort this? We could all be forgiven for believing that a budget deficit can be cured very simply, and the obvious way of curing it is either to increase rates of taxation or to reduce expenditure, or a combination of the two. Those two, surprisingly, are relatively puny devices. By far the greatest factor in terms of sorting out the budget deficit is an increase in the GDP per head of the population. Now, there are two reasons why that is. If your GDP per head increases, what that then means is the tax take goes up automatically without any nasty rate increases, because the revenues flowing through the economy are that much greater. And that's the first benefit. And the second benefit, of course, is that with all else being equal, if the economy grows by that size, then that 0.7% deficit can easily become a 0.3 or a 0.2% deficit, because the gross domestic product has actually increased quite dramatically. The cause of the deficit was the decline in the gross domestic product per head of this country, which is known as the productivity puzzle. It's a puzzle which people still do not understand, and because they do not understand it, they don't really know how it's going to unravel. Now, this is what the OBR says. They're quite open about it. They don't understand what caused it. They look at it. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says that our productivity growth has been dismal. Now, the whole issue of productivity is really central to this, because the only way we're going to have increased and improved living standards for the nation as a whole is if our GDP per head increases. There was a sudden decline in 2009, 2010. People don't understand why. And until there is that recovery in that GDP per head, then effectively there will be a continuation of the struggle in order to balance the books, and also to increase the living standards of the whole of the UK. Now, my last slide, I'd just like to address the question of inflation, and this is what our Institute for Fiscal Studies says, that 27 will mark the return of inflation. And obviously, it's going to mark the return of inflation for our economy. Now, throughout the talk so far, Brexit has not featured as an economic cause, and it's not surprising it hasn't featured. The only real consequence that one can put down to Brexit so far is the decline in the value of sterling when compared to our main trading nations. So the dollar value of sterling is especially important because so many commodities are priced in dollars. A 20% decline in the dollar, in the value of sterling against the dollar, a 17% decline in sterling against the euro, and that actually means that we are importing inflation. The Institute for Fiscal Studies reckons that factor, the way that passes through the economy and the share it has in CPI, will lead to an overall increase of 3% in terms of inflation overall. The Office for Budget Responsibility does it more by more of a rule of thumb method, rather more crudely, and they estimate a 2% increase. Now, what we're looking at is that by the late 2017, the expectation is that inflation will be about 2.7%, and by late 2018, it will then be down to about 2.6%. And that inflation is the one factor I think we can lay at the door of the Brexit referendum. But if we look at actually what's going to happen in the next few years through to the forecast period, 21, 22, it's going to be the issue of the Great Recession working its way through the economy and continuing to create surprises. Now, the fact we've got that inflation, of course, that's actually going to suck capacity out of household consumption. The household consumption has been the prime mover of the economy throughout 2016. It manly took over again when business investment ceased. And it will come as no surprise that because of that factor, that domestic consumption is going to be under pressure, that what's the forecasts are now looking, once again, they're looking for business investment to start taking over that role as prime mover, the role of creating the demand in the economy. So in 2018, 19 and onwards, they're looking for the role of business investment to increase once more. So the whole thing goes round in a circle, but until we can resolve the issue of the gross domestic product per head of the population, then we'll continue to have these problems in terms of the economy of this country. So that's a very brief and quick counter through. I hope it's made some sort of sense.